I'm Charlie O'Donnell from Brooklyn Bridge Ventures, and super excited to have this conversation because it's one that I have pretty frequently, and it's a fun one for me to have because I can sort of think back over my career and think about all the sort of things that had to happen for me to wind up in venture, and also how unique everybody's path is in venture capital. So I've recently been talking to two people who are interested in the startup scene, and everybody is always thinking about, where's my career going? What are my next steps? What should I be doing now? And we got into this conversation about venture, and I asked them to help me have this conversation and answer this question for our audience about getting into venture and, what are those sort of possible career paths in it. So I'll take a moment to have our moderators, but also participants, because I've got some questions for them too, to introduce themselves. So Abby, why don't you start off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Abby Hebby. I'm really excited to be here today to interview Charlie. He's someone I've been watching for quite some time since he's such a visionary. I've been in media and sales for the last 10 years, working for a startup called Mental Floss and some more iconic publishers like the Washington Post and the New York Times. Most recently at the New York Times, I was part of a specialized team called Story X, where we help fund the commercial needs of the newsroom while also providing better user experiences for our readers. I worked with clients like JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, HPE, and American Express. I'm really looking forward to learning from Charlie and picking his brain a bit more about how my career in sales and media can be transferable to both the startup and the venture capital world, since I'm highly interested in providing better experiences for people and the disruption of industries.
Cool. And Lucy?
Thank you, Charlie. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucy Cole. I'm originally from New Zealand, but I moved to New York City back in 2018 to really sort of focus on, my career and developing myself as a financial professional. I've just over 5 years of work experience. Started my career back in New Zealand in a Big Four accounting firm in corporate finance, where I sort of developed, a good foundation of valuation, financial modeling, and M&A skills. And then when I moved over to New York City, I'm still working for now, a large sort of hyper growth startup, if you will, company, and I've had a very enriched and kind of more than a bargain for experience working for this company. So it's been amazing. And concurrently, during my career, I've also studied and completed all 3 levels of the CFA program. So I've always had an interest in business, finance, and investing. And I think that stems from my father, who's a business owner himself. And I think sort of, looking to the future, I'm really looking at ways in which I can sort of marry my sort of interest in finance, investing in business with my experience and qualifications. Some people sort of see my experience has been a little bit, sort of interesting. So I'm looking to really marry those and see how I can sort of pivot or sort of break into the world of private markets. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you, Charlie, about all of this. And I'm sure, there's been a big interest in this discussion, and I'm sure a lot of people sort of in same shoes as Abby and I, coming from sort of a different sort of background to sort of the traditional private market VC world. And I'll just sort of finish off my little intro by just saying that, from speaking with a wide range of people, and also just thinking about New York City, for example, being like one of the financial hubs of the world, the land of opportunity, maybe naively, but I'm kind of coming into the city thinking, so many opportunities. But I think what I've found is that, New York City attracts a wide range of talented and diverse humans. And so actually, there's really a person out there who will fit that exact skill the company is looking for to a T. So really that's kind of been my experience. That's why I'd love to talk to you, Charlie, about your insights here and what it's sort of how you can really break into the world or pivot, as I don't really like to call it, but kind of pivot, I guess, into a career that you really want to sort of get into. In this case, for me, and a lot of people obviously on the call, venture capital, private markets. And then also once you're there, what it takes to really succeed and stand out. So with that introduction, I'll pass it back to Abby, and we can sort of get into our conversation. Charlie.
I'm just realizing too how my dad's job probably is very relevant to what I do as well. He was a New York City fireman, and I feel like I just help startups put out fires all the time. So I guess it's equally as relevant.
So I'm going to kick it off, but to the audience, I want to let you know that if you do have some questions, feel free to put them in the chat on the side. And if we have some time, we'll see if we can get to them a little bit later.
Cool.
So firstly, Charlie, Lucy and I, as you can tell, come from very different backgrounds, as well as this audience definitely comes from different backgrounds. So what would you say are the background and the skills that are really sought after in the venture capital world?
So one thing I would say is venture firms are very different from each other, and they're structured differently. They are different across stage. They're different across focus. And so there's actually firms might look for a wide range of skills. So for example, an early stage firm might be looking for somebody who is either more interested in particular technologies, have sector expertise to understand what's coming next. Where should I be looking, right? A later stage firm is basically evaluating businesses that already exist, right? So somebody with the sort of hardcore financial modeling skills and all that to understand, hey, this company's doing $30 million this year. Based on everything I know about the financials and the due diligence and the market opportunity, what's the likelihood that this company can do 80 and then 150 and then 250 as per their model? When I'm investing at Brooklyn Bridge Ventures, I'm lucky if I have two people in a PowerPoint, right? So I don't my financial skills have withered to, I can barely open a spreadsheet at this point, right? So it is really different based on the firm. And I would say that the other thing too is some firms look for particular sector expertise, right? They're sort of more research driven, more thesis driven. They want to see you interested in an area, whether it's security or crypto or DTC or branding or whatever. Other firms are looking for more generalists. The other thing I would say too is if you're coming in at different levels, like I think a lot of times when we have this conversation, it's the idea of coming in at a non-partner level. Mm-hmm. And, but there are firms that hire partners. What ultimately is a firm looking for a non-partner to do? And sometimes it's sourcing, right? So for example, when I got hired by First Round Capital back in 2009, I think more than anything else, it was my network in New York that was the reason why I got hired. It had nothing to do with my ability to vet. I had no real sort of proof of that. It was literally, they were looking to get plugged into the New York ecosystem. They looked around and said, who seems to know a lot of people here? And I was deeply involved in the community, right? Mm-hmm. That's a particular thing that they were looking for from the sourcing side, right? Whereas the partners are still going to do sort of majority of the picking and all that sort of stuff. Whereas some other firms are maybe very partner driven. And the reality is, if you go to work, for example, for the first firm that I ever worked for, Union Square Ventures, those partners are pretty prominent, very visible people. I would imagine that the partners at Union Square get most of the deals, right? So I would guess today, now it's been 15 years since I worked there, that those folks are counted on less for sourcing and more for research and thoroughness and kicking the tires on a thesis and all that sort of stuff. So I sort of think there's a firm for every skill set.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Good to know.
That's super interesting. And I guess so. Abby's just moved to Denver, and as I mentioned, I've not just moved to New York City, but I'm not a native here, and I think starting to build those networks and everything, it sounds like obviously it takes time, and so my question would be then, what if someone's in sort of a position like us, we're sort of new to a place, what can we be doing now to get sort of develop the skills, to build a network, really position ourselves so that when an opportunity kind of comes around the corner, we're sort of, and put our best foot forward for that. And it does sound like sort of each firm's different. And like, for example, I'm 5 years into my career, and so I don't really have sort of a sector expertise, for example. But I guess what sort of skills, or how can we best sort of gear ourselves up to sort of kind of get our break and get it?
So first of all, everybody brings a different skill set to the table, right? So rather than think about it as, what do I not have yet that would enable me to get in somewhere, I would sort of say, well, what do I have? And is it obvious that I have this? And is it easily accessible by venture firms? So for example, like you did something that I wasn't able to do, you passed the CFA, right? So like, your way around financial statements, and I would have no problem. For example, I had a company pitching me yesterday where like some of the things they were saying about their financial model works just didn't make sense to me at all. And it's an interesting business, but they really need help on their financials. I think that skill set, let's say you became the person who said, hey, if you are a technical founder or a design founder or basically a non-business founder, and you need to think about what your financial model looks like and prepare financial models for startups, you could be that go-to person. And let's think about that, for example, right? You may be sick of financial modeling, right? You may be like, I'm so tired of this. I never want to look at a spreadsheet again. I want to do all this cool venture tech stuff. But I think you got to use what you have, right? And if you imagine like, well, why would a VC want to hire me? Well, a VC might want to hire me because I'm connected to a lot of startups. So what do you have today that could connect you to a lot of startups? If you became, and maybe it's something you do on the side as a consultant. Maybe it's a nights and weekends project. Maybe you put up a web page somewhere and you just talk about, the financial modeling. And I would say, I'm actually not making this up, there is a gap in the market for that, because there are companies like Propeller and Early Growth Financial Services and all of those folks that do that for companies that are going concerns. But before you raise funding, before you're even a business, just to figure out like, can this thing get larger? Like how much money am I going to need? How do I figure out how to raise? I don't have a go-to person for that, to be honest. And if somebody sort of put themselves out there, you would actually get to see these companies before VCs would.
Yeah.
Like if you could offer something that is like, help get your pitch deck better, and you would be, you could essentially get a head start on the sourcing aspect of it, right? So it's like, what do you have now, and how do you market that to the community? That's where I would sort of start.
Okay. Yeah, and I actually was going to tap onto that question as well. To what extent, like operational experience is valuable versus direct investment experience? And one of the things that I've been thinking about is it worth kind of jumping into a smaller startup and being sort of on a lean team and helping the company raise its Series A, B, C, whatever it may be. And so I think what you're sort of saying as well is like that can help, and it's sort of helping these companies do that, whether it's some external consulting or even within a company, and being able to help a company through that.
Yeah, I think the comment I'll make about joining a company as a bridge to potentially going into venture, and I'll say this too. the things that make you useful to a venture capital firm overlap highly with the things that make you useful to a startup, right? So regardless of anybody on this call winds up in venture, and look, the reality is there are just very few job openings any given year. There are many people who hone their skill sets with an eye towards venture that never get there, but have a fantastic career doing a whole bunch of other things for startups, right? So I think there's a usefulness to sort of focus on how can I be useful to startup companies? And then, maybe that turns into venture. Maybe that turns into, doing, consulting for a bunch of companies. Maybe that turns into jumping into one. But the one thing I would be careful about, this idea of like, maybe I'll do a startup tour of duty before this venture thing. Think about a VC portfolio, right? For every 30 companies, 3 of them really work. Half of them are zeros. The chances that your one pick works out, it's just, so unlikely. If you look at somebody like Caitlin Strandberg, who works for Lyra Hippo, right? She worked for Behance. She worked for LearnVest. What are the chances of going 2 for 2 in the startup world, right? It's very easy to be like, oh, I'll mimic my career after Caitlin. I'll go work at 2 successful startups. Yeah. If you know how to do that, please tell me. I have a hard enough time picking the 2 or 3 successful startups out of 30. Going for two is incredibly difficult. That's why I try and push people, if they can and they can sort of manage the flexibility of it, to think about smaller ways of interacting with a portfolio of companies, right? To be this like, helping people raise, not necessarily being a broker, but like helping people get ready to raise, helping people with their financials, helping people build out a marketing plan, helping people nail that first enterprise sales client, whatever that is, and say, hey, I have a thing that I do with 2 or 3 startups at a time for 3 to 6 months a piece. And I'm kind of getting to know as many companies as possible, because if you start to build that portfolio and over a 2-year period, it's 5, 10, 15 companies, now you've got a better than average shot of one of those companies maybe growing and you saying, well, actually, I went from sales consultant to a portfolio of companies to leading enterprise sales for one of them, and having a higher chance of that happening.
That's super interesting. So now that we just talked a little bit more about like the practical experience and the hands-on experience, I've seen you say how you haven't gone to an Ivy League school, like a lot of other people in VC and the startup world. So how important do you really think it is to actually have your MBA?
Well, I don't have it. And look, I think there's multiple paths, right? If you look at all of the professionals in venture capital, I would guess that north of 50% have an MBA, right?
Right.
But that's the wrong stat to look at. If you looked at all of the MBAs who wanted to be in venture and who wound up there, it's very low. It's very low, right? So, that's not necessarily a way to say, oh, if I get an MBA, I can get into venture, just because, look, a disproportionate number of people in venture have MBAs from Stanford or Harvard. But how many people who went to Stanford and Harvard wanted to be in venture, right? That's the more meaningful stat for you. So, look, I think there are benefits to some of that stuff, right? Look, there's a reality of, if you go into Harvard and go to their MBA program, you have this instant network of ambitious, well-connected people. And look, if the reality of venture capital is a lot of the venture capital positions that people have are created, right? Like, I work for a firm where I raised the money to be the investor, right? Brooklyn Bridge Ventures is not my capital. I mean, some tiny percentage of it is, but most of it is not, right? Being in circles of people from, sort of Ivy League, MBA, whatever, unfortunately, it is an advantage, right? Like being connected to money is an advantage in venture. That's just the reality of the situation, right? It's not a level playing field by any stretch of the imagination. However, the thing I think about grad school is that it's everything is replicable if you're disciplined enough and you're directed enough, right? So I don't think there's anything in an MBA program that you couldn't replicate if you were very directed about networking, very directed about self-education, very directed about working on projects, right? Getting groups of people together. How many people would do that? Probably not, right? Like I literally know one person who replicated their own MBA. And so you got to be honest with yourself. Like, would you do it otherwise? And the reality for a lot of people is they wouldn't.
Yeah. In undergrad, I did all the business classes. I got a degree in business management. And I think that I've had way more learning experiences hands-on on the job than anything that I learned in college, to be perfectly honest.
For sure. And I think one of the most difficult things about education and your resume is level setting.
Right.
What I mean by that is when I was an undergrad, I wanted to go into the investment world. And as far as I could tell, I did everything that somebody could in my position. Had a good GPA, had a really good internship. I ran the finance club. I checked all the boxes any reasonable college student could think of, right? I didn't realize until after I got out of college that some schools have student managed investment funds where some donor donates like $1 million to the school for the students in some kind of class to go invest. I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't know anyone do that. Had I known that was a thing, I would have created one, right? And then I would have not only been somebody who had that on my resume, I would have been one of the few people who was responsible for creating it, right? But I just I didn't know that was like a reasonable expectation, right? So I think especially now, I think people get tracked into things where they're like, I'm going to succeed at everything that is put in front of me, but without sort of picking our heads up and going like, oh, what should I be doing, right? Like what does everybody else do? And see that there are some people who are, kind of making leaps, right? There are some people who aren't applying for jobs as they come up. There are some people who are just creating angel groups, right? Who would have thought that a 24-year-old could create an angel group? But the reality of running an angel group is just, are you willing to do the work? Are you willing to set up the meetings? Are you willing to coordinate all of the calls and write up a bunch of one-pagers and all of this sort of stuff? It's frankly more of an admin position than it is an investor position. And if you just gather a lot of people together and you're willing to do the work, but like no one's out there telling a 23-year-old to start an angel group. And most 23-year-olds are like, why would anyone join my angel group?
Mm-hmm. That imposter syndrome, feeling too young, not qualified enough,
right?
Not knowing that others maybe have and feeling inspired by them. It's interesting hearing your sort of like look back and sort of, had I known what I know now. Because for me, I've got sort of my story sort of, I've got a similar thought, which is investment banking. Like, had I known in America how important it is to go to banking, if you want to, the traditional background of getting into the private markets, two or 3 years of banking, maybe from a certain school. In New Zealand, there's a couple of companies with a few jobs, very competitive, and you don't need to do banking to get into private equity or private markets in New Zealand. So my father came from business, but didn't go to university. So it's hindsight. Yeah, it's if only we knew what we knew back then. But that's why we're sort of here today as well. It's like, how can we not course correct, but how can we sort of now that we know what we know, and what else can we do? Not just checking the boxes, but what else can we think of ourselves, or have discussions like this to come up with to sort of.
I would think about differentiation too, right? Like, yeah, banking would be useful, but a lot of other people go into banking, right? Does that separate you from somebody else? I just found out the other day, one of my favorite chains that I would go to take meetings and all that sort of stuff, Le Pen got sold out of bankruptcy for $3 million. Like, that's crazy town that it's that low. Now, there's rent obligations and stuff like that, so it's probably going to cost the owner more than $3 million. But anybody who had sort of a banking background or all that sort of stuff could have, just for shits and giggles, gathered a bunch of people together and said, let's try to buy Le Pen. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, look, I was an investor in Ample Hills, and we unfortunately went through a bankruptcy process. They sold for like a little more than $1 million, and the last guy standing in the bankruptcy process was a guy who like owned a machine parts company, right? And so far they've been running really well, but like I sort of feel like your investment banking buddies, had they known about the opportunity, like you probably could have gotten a pool of 15 people together and bought Ample Hills if you want to, but like nobody thinks to do that. Hey, let's go find something to buy. Let's not wait for a private equity job to open up. Let's go buy a business, right? I mean, how many businesses are going to wind up bankrupt, unfortunately, this year? Like maybe like that's like, if I was thinking about being in private equity now, I'd be on the hunt for buying businesses. That's what I would be doing rather than waiting for a private equity job to open up.
Yeah, being more proactive and kind of creating your own opportunities.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I think when we talk about industries and people think about like pooling money together, there's one industry that like comes top of mind that like a lot of people go in as like partners, like real estate, for example. So that it's interesting to like reshape your mindset and get a bunch of partners together to potentially buy a business.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the other thing too is, and this is sort of how I work, and I know this isn't necessarily everybody's sort of MO, but I'm all about gathering groups. I'm really big into sort of, I mean, look, there's 60, 70 people on this call right now, right? Is gathering community together, and you can't do the venture job in a bubble, right? Like you need to have a community of people. You need to have a community of people who are sourcing things from you, for you. You're looking for intros to stuff. You're looking for expertise, right? And so one of the things that, if I were to ever hire anybody, which I'm not interested in hiring anybody on the investment side, is what community does this person participate in, right? Like where are they currently in the flow of deals, and not just one or two, but you could imagine plotting out the New York City or Denver or whatever kind of ecosystem and say there are certain people who are more well positioned to see opportunities at startups to fund them or join them than others, right? And how do you put yourself in that position? And it's not sitting behind a laptop and poking around Crunchbase. It's getting out there and create. I think a lot of it is creating community, and people could do that in many different ways, right? They could do it live, they could do it through a newsletter, through a podcast, through building these networks and stuff like that. I think you look at something like like On Deck, right? What Eric Torenberg and those guys built, right? They just basically said, hey, we're creating a resource for sort of pre-company founders. They're seeing a lot of deal flow before it's deal flow, right? And no one asked them to do that. They just sort of took a look at the ecosystem and decided to be, I mean, frankly, it's being entrepreneurial, which like, I think it's a big plus to be a little bit entrepreneurial if you're looking for a job in venture, you know?
So I'd love to know, so how do you do it? I guess a couple of things. How do you do it with a team of two, really at BBB? And then also, like, you sort of did touch on this earlier, but the VC industry, sort of, what is it like? I can imagine, there's a lot of VC firms out there. There's a lot of great ideas out there, and a lot of VCs looking to back them. I can imagine it being quite competitive. A lot of people out there wanting, looking at the same sort of stuff. How would you describe the VC industry in terms of that competition between the firms, between like the people working in the industry, the sort of backgrounds and I guess different types of firms? I know that was a lot.
Yeah, no, the competition really depends on where you are in the ecosystem, right? If you are a seed-based investor in Silicon Valley, I cannot even imagine the competition, let alone if you're not at, name your top 3 firms or whatever, right? I mean, could you imagine being not Sequoia, not, Lightspeed, not whoever at YC Demo Day? Like, what do you even, like other than just walking around with a bucket full of cash, how do you win deals there? It's crazy town, right? And this is why, a lot of the startups come out of Y Combinator, raise bigger rounds than you would expect at higher valuations, because the only way you can win those deals is by paying more and being quicker, right? That's not something I would want to do. That's not of interest to me. And some people thrive on that competition, right? But I think in New York it's very different, right? There's less, call it pedigree on the founders. You're not necessarily backing someone who, is a 2-time YC founder, exited to Google, who built, whatever database for Amazon kind of thing. Entrepreneurs in New York kind of fall out of the sky. I mean, it's sort of a random crew. They come from different industries. They focus on different things. So the best deals aren't obvious. I led the seed round of Petal, the credit card company that just recently raised Series C. That round was anybody's round to do. I led it. A bunch of people were poking around. A couple of bigger firms that we thought we were going to get across the table didn't. So we wound up with like a $3 million round that only had like 400K committed right before Thanksgiving. And so, I mean, if you had a check, you could have gotten into that round, right? There's like 21 people on the cap table. Totally not competitive at all. One of the best performing companies in New York, right? But it was pre-launch. It was first-time founders, right? So it wasn't obvious, right? And so, in New York, in the super early stage market, it isn't that competitive, I think. Now, there are some deals that some people see and others don't see, right? There's an unfair advantage to having a certain size network and all of that sort of stuff. So you're always trying to sort of get out there and everything else like that. So on the how do we do it with less people? Everybody's got their own style. I think my approach is one where I know that most of the risks are unknown, right? And most of the risks have to do with execution and not knowable things, right? So for example, like I take the position that very rarely is the thing that crushes a startup a competitor, at least in the early days, right? Everybody says, well, why can't Google build this? Well, like, it's very rare that startups die because Google built the same thing. Most times startups die because they're just A, really hard, B, some founders are just not good at running a company, which, like, you wouldn't know that until you back them to run a company, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's like, at least at the stage that I'm in, there's not a lot that you can figure out and that you can know definitively ahead of time. So I don't have this 3-month hardcore due diligence process because there's like hardly any information, right? Now, I'm comfortable with that, right? And this may be stating the obvious, but if you're going to be an early stage venture capital, you have to be really comfortable with risk.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know,
I can imagine.
yeah, and knowing that, like, there are some things that you don't know, right? And that's across your life too. Like, I agreed to, move in together with my wife after 8 or 9 months, and we got married, or we got engaged maybe 15 months after we met.
Wow.
Married like 18 months after we met, right?
That's amazing.
But like,
so you've always been kind of had a high risk appetite, like through and through, kind of growing up. You've always sort of been more, high risk tolerance.
you know what? It's a little different than saying high risk, right? It's more like I think it's more about being thoughtful about risk.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Is it like realizing that, like, hey, like, do you have the mindset? Do you have the right mindset going into this relationship? Do I feel like there's going to be a lot of stuff in the future that we're not going to know, and we're just going to have to deal with?
Yeah.
Do I feel like I can deal with that? Do I feel like we can work anything out? Right. So and I think that's a lot of times what you're dealing with in a startup is like, there are going to be problems that we haven't foreseen. Do I think that this is going to be a good relationship in talking this out, right? Do I like your approach to thinking about stuff, right? You can't prepare for everything necessarily. And look, think about what we talk about risk, right? The reality is it's mostly other people's capital, right? It's, if you are able to raise a fund, it's a guaranteed management fee for a particular period of time, right? So everybody who's working in venture capital right now, as long as they are operating out of a fund that still has money in it, it literally has 100% job security.
Yeah.
Does that seem like really high risk? It's not as, I almost think it's much more risky, like, if you're a restaurateur right now, right? If you're, a small business person, where, there isn't a backup, like, it's your deposit on the line for the rent and all of that sort of stuff, right? So, plus, I'm college educated, I have a good network. Like, if this doesn't work out, I think I'm employable, right? And so, but that's sort of my approach to risk. And with the 2 people thing, I think it's important to know, it's really one person on the investment team, and Lauren, sort of runs the operational aspect of the firm. I think you should be very self-aware in what kind of environments you thrive in and which you don't, right? I worked at 3 very different venture firms over my career, right? I worked at Union Square Ventures, which at the time is a very partner-driven firm. They're getting sort of most of the deal flow. It was a great experience as an analyst, as a 25-year-old, where, like, every meeting, I didn't even take a meeting on my own ever. I was always with Brad or Fred in a meeting, just learning from them and just watching what questions they would ask and all of that sort of stuff, right? When I went to First Round Capital, it's very, very team oriented. I'm not great at team, to be honest. Like, if I really like a deal, I don't want to have to ask permission.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to convince anybody else. I
Mhm.
know I could be wrong. I want to live and die by my own sword. So like I'm very proud of the 2 years I spent there and the 8 companies I got over the finish line, and 4 of them had really terrific exits. But it wasn't the environment that I thrived in the most.
Yeah.
Because every one of those deals required at least 3 votes from partners, and and they're all terrifically smart people. If they all raised individual funds and I had the money, I would back them, right? But it's a very different fit than what I do now.
Yeah, sounds like you're very aware of sort of what works best for you and
Right.
and your sort of natural, kind of your strengths and what suits you best, and you've kind of set yourself up for that environment to help, which will help you succeed.
Try. Well, looks like Abby's got a question.
Yeah. So I recently saw how you invested in a company called Base just after the first meeting. So I'd love to learn a little bit more what goes on in your brain now that we just talked about how you navigate the uncertain waters. You see a ton of pitches. What are you looking for when you're actually making an investment?
Sure. Did Lola share that was a first meeting thing, or did I?
No, I read an article about it, and I'm very interested in this new day-to-day health tracking in your home and
Gotcha.
helping just with natural ailments and stuff.
Cool. So I think a couple of things about how that came to pass. So first of all, I think one of the jobs of a generalist investor is to kind of always be in the flow of information and new things and kind of looking at stuff. And you have to be a curious person. So if you walk into a meeting and you have to start from scratch, from the, how do I feel about consumers and their health? And being proactive about their health. If you're starting from zero, you're never going to get there, right? You're just not going to have a time. There's nothing you can really Google around and get a definitive, provable answers. You have to have a view. I think you have to be kind of opinionated, right? And with that, I think you have to have strong opinions, especially on the consumer side, about where the friction points are. And, could I go out and get these tests, right? Could I have my blood sugar and cortisol and all these other things tested? Well, yeah, I guess I could, but I'd have to leave my house and I'd have to know what to test for. And then I'd have to figure out what's good, what's bad, and then I'd have to do my own research. I'm already exhausted just even thinking about it, right? So the friction from a practical standpoint is high. However, I'm also conscious of health and the reality that weight does not necessarily equal health, and how there's other stuff going on in your body sometimes that's just very difficult to notice. And I do believe that sort of what's going on both on the inside and the outside sort of affects each other, right? You may be, your body shape may be changing and you're worried about your diet, but it actually turns out that you're stressed. Right? And who hasn't been stressed over the past 7 months, right? And so maybe it's time for you to be checking your cortisol levels on a regular basis and to take that stress test to understand what stress is doing to your body, right? So all of that kind of stuff rang true to me when it was pitched. And, when I think of Lola, the founder, she's an engineer, she's a tinkerer, she's kind of the, female Tim Ferriss, kind of like, she's always hacking, tweaking, testing everything out. And so she's, I mean, she's not a medical doctor, but she's knowledgeable enough to be dangerous, which I think is like the right sweet spot, right? It's somebody who looks at an area, cares about it, gets really into it, but isn't, encumbered by all of the sort of institutional friction around it, right? Who's willing to be a little bit hacky about it. She also, as an engineer, knows how technology gets built, I had a high degree of confidence that she could get a product, kind of out the door. And I really liked our conversation. I thought that, look, VCs share ideas all the time. A lot of them are not good ones, frankly. Mm-hmm. I feel like when I discuss with her, I get listened to and I get pushback, right? And I think like that's the sweet spot of the conversation that I kind of want to get into. We came up with a what we thought was sort of the right deal. And to me, like, that's all right? I'm going to do that 30 times across this portfolio. Give me a big enough space where, like, personal, proactive health, as certainly a big category, right? Like, who cares about what they eat? Who cares about what the internal things going on in their body does to affect sleep? Who cares about stress? It's like everybody, right? Do I think this founder has the capability to build a product and alter course, pivot, navigate the product over time? Like, yeah, I do. First time founder, like, do I know that she can run a 100-person company? No. I don't know that she wants to run a 100-person. Like, this thing will develop over time. We'll see where the company is in 5 years. Maybe she will do that difficult founder thing of extricating herself from the product so she can be a great manager. Or maybe she'll hire that person. Like, who knows? But I have a high degree of confidence that I can have an honest conversation with her, at that time to understand what she wants, what's best for the company, and all that sort of stuff. So that's, so that's where I was with Base at that kind of early stage. And that was I think it was a cold pitch. I think it was a cold intro. I'm pretty sure it was, because I don't. I'm almost certain that I didn't get it from anybody else. She just reached out, and that's one of the things too that I'm trying to do with Firm is to create the most accessible firm. Is to say, hey, like you don't need to know somebody who I know. Like, I'll just take it on face value. Now, what that does mean is sometimes it takes a while for me to get back to people by email, and a lot of times you're dealing with like very random, very, like not venture backable stuff. But if you're patient and that people have good intentions, you sort of, you don't mind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Base is going to be huge, and I can't wait to get my hands on one of those tests one day.
Yeah, the hard part is, as I found out, just being comfortable with blood. You got to be able to, do that little finger prick with the little spring-loaded thing. And I'm not the best at that, but
just look away.
Yeah.
What would you say is your sort of typical? Because that seemed like it was quite a quick, decision on, great first impression, great pitch, great, everything's super quick. What would be your sort of typical like time horizon, if there is one, of like from first hearing of an idea or being pitched to deciding to invest? And if it's not like too much to ask, or if it's not too confidential, curious to know sort of how many deals or opportunities or pitches you'd look at, say, on a yearly basis, and to what percentage you probably do a deal with them.
Yeah, I see about 2,000 things in a year, and by C, that means like emails, basically, right? I take about 150 first-time pitch meetings in a year. So, and that's something that people don't talk about a lot. Is people say, oh, well, how do you make a great pitch? Well, the first thing you got to do is get into the meeting. Right? That's a big cut, right? How do you get a meeting? And for me, my bar for taking a meeting is, can I see myself doing this deal? Is the space big enough? Do I feel like this is the right founder? Is it an interesting plan? Do I feel like the meeting would be productive? And so that's, I see about 150 of those. I would say 80% I'm ready to pass right in the first meeting.
Okay.
So about 30 deals a year, I'll do like some real serious work on. And then I'll do like 8, 9 deals in a year.
Mm-hmm.
So from 2000 to like 8.
Wow, that's a large funnel and starting point to, small percentage kind of gets through.
Yeah, you made a comment before that there are a lot of great ideas. Actually, there aren't.
Okay.
There's a lot of bad ideas. There's
Yeah.
a lot of really bad ideas.
Okay, there are a lot of ideas.
There's a lot of ideas, right? Very few of them are great ideas. And and that's the reality, is that like people always think that there's this power dynamic with VCs because we're the ones that write the check. And like I do get that money creates some kind of power, but the reality is there's way more money than there are good deals.
Mm-hmm.
When you don't have a backable idea, or you're struggling with your business, the power dynamic seems very skewed, right? You keep thinking like, oh, if only this person wrote a check, then I would be successful. And it's very easy to think that, but it's probably not the case. There are ideas that need more work, more vetting, and there's just some really terrible markets out there that like, sometimes I want to tell people like, just do something else. Like this isn't, it's hard. When you have something and you have something and you have the capability to execute it, you are in the driver's seat, and look, funding's a pain in the neck. Not everybody gets it or whatever, but some founders walk in and they know their thing is a thing and they tell you what they're going to do, and they're just asking you whether you're along for the ride. They're not asking you whether or not it's a good idea. They know it's a good idea.
Yeah. And they're probably, I don't know, if you've got that much confidence, conviction, obviously sometimes, confidence can maybe not be justified, but oftentimes, that's a great, if a founder's that confident in themselves, isn't that a great first step of you wanting to, believing in the company and the person?
For sure.
So Charlie, I hate to make you pick your favorite, but I'd love to know, what is the deal you're most proud of and why?
Oh, I definitely don't have a particular favorite. So plus I would, having invested in 80 companies or so, I would make 79 people very upset. So I'm not about to, sort of fall into that trap. Although I guess there's a handful of people whose businesses didn't work out that wouldn't mind if I didn't pick them as their favorite. But I think in general, just from a profile of deal, I think my favorite ones are where it's maybe not the most obvious founder, but they've really put their work in. One where it's a real collaborative, kind of deal. There are some deals where I wound up backing a great founder. They're terrific at running their company. Company's going to be really successful. They really never, ever reached out for any help along the way. And it's kind of nice in the fact that it doesn't I don't have to spend any time on it, but that's not my approach. I like to be helpful. So I can tell you there are a handful of deals that I will probably make really good money on that I didn't really do much for. And I'll let you know how I feel when I get that check. but it's not super fun, to be honest. Right. But then there are other deals where sometimes it's frustrating, right? Just working hell as other human beings, right? Like it's like sometimes working styles do not mesh at all, and it's super frustrating. And I have a very particular style. I'm very direct. And I'm sure there are folks who think that I'm difficult and I'm sort of a pain in the neck. And, I think sometimes personalities can clash, and you try and step up and you try and make it productive, but it doesn't always work out. And those are the sort of frustrating things.
Yeah, very interesting.
So conscious, we have about 5 more minutes left, I guess officially. I don't know if,
and I think we got a couple of questions too, in the Q&A section.
Okay. Yeah, and I was just gonna say, I don't know if we can finish the conversation quite without even asking you, what makes someone successful in VC? Because the nature of VC versus, or private markets versus public market investing is, often can take much longer for you to realize whether your investments are successful or not. And so it's harder to sort of get that more, regular feedback. And so what is your sort of view on what makes someone successful in VC?
So one of the things I think people really need to do is to be very careful about who we treat as successful in venture capital. And I think VCs are sometimes put on a pedestal. And, look, if you have gotten to be financially successful from being a VC, right? Like you have returned capital to your investors and you have gotten carry checks and all of that sort of stuff. Like we would say that VC is successful, right? We don't necessarily see what that performance looks like, right? Like we don't necessarily know, sometimes you could sort of imagine, who's successful and who's not. But there are some people who are very visible and we assume success, but we don't really know, right? Mm-hmm. Every single time I've been introduced on a panel or whatever, somebody's like, oh, we have this successful VC or whatever. And I'm like, I'll let you know after I get my first carry check, right? Like, my oldest companies are 7 years old. Like literally the oldest company that I've invested in at Brooklyn Bridge Ventures is just now hitting the point where you would expect an investment and an exit outcome to happen soon, right? That's the oldest. That means the vast majority of the companies that I have invested in are not there yet, right? And I'm excited for the next year. I mean, there's 2 or 3 companies that are sort of starting to have those kinds of conversations, right? But lots of things that happen in between now and then. So I think we should all be a little more, check our egos at the door as to who's successful in venture and who's not. Mm-hmm. I think it's twofold. I think you got to get lucky enough early enough to get the opportunity to continue to invest. So if I look at my career, I got the opportunity to lead investments when I was at First Round Capital. I did 8 deals. 4 of them exited. Okay. That's lucky, right? That is not I don't believe necessarily. I mean, what can you give me credit for, right? I was fishing in the right holes. I was well connected into New York or whatever. But as a picker, that is an unusual amount of success for somebody's first 8 deals, right? And so, but because of that track record, I was able to raise my own fund. And so if I didn't have, I had 2 exits, single platform and group me, happen in the first 2 years of the lives of those companies, right? Very rarely do you get a 2-year track record with 2 exits, right? That's like becoming a 00 and having your 2 kills so you can, get that license, right? So that enabled me to invest. And I think I'm a better investor today, having invested in 70-something companies at Brooklyn Bridge Ventures, than when I first started and I was doing my first 8 deals. We'll see over the next few years as to whether or not that pans out. But so you got to get lucky enough early enough.
Okay.
And then I also think, I do think you have to take some risk. And a little bit of career risk too, in the sense that, like, I've had somebody ask me, like, do you think that I should go to a top tier firm like you did at the beginning of your career? And because I worked at Union Square Ventures. Well, Union Square Ventures wasn't a top tier firm when I joined, right? In 2004, 2005, nobody knew who the heck Union Square Ventures was, right? Brad and Fred were known in the New York City ecosystem, but they weren't national sort of top tier VCs that everybody knew. It was the deals that they did at USB that really put them on the map, right? So I took an enormous amount of firm risk, and I took a lot of geographic risk. When I took the pitch from Union Square Ventures in 2004, I was at an institutional investor. They were pitching me, and then I wound up joining them. The idea of starting a New York-based venture capital firm in New York seemed like a terrifically stupid idea. Like, I dismissed it out of hand. I almost did not want to take the meeting, right?
Wow.
So it was a non-obvious thing. And I can't even take credit for, like, I saw New York as the place to be, whatever. I'm a born and bred New Yorker that'll probably never leave. So it's just like, I get credit for picking New York. Where was I going to go? I don't want to live in San Francisco. I was not, Boston's the last place on the face of the earth that I would ever move. So no offense to, all of the Bostonites, but, I was just happened to be a New Yorker, and the timing was right on New York becoming a, top venture ecosystem.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I'm open to jumping into a couple of more of these questions if we want to, push it a little bit.
Yeah.
Sure. So someone from the audience asked, curious to know, what are some of the red flags that you look for when evaluating a company?
Yeah, sure. Market's got to be big enough. The way that you make money has to make sense for how expensive those dollars are. So what I mean, and the example I probably use all the time, is you think about, like, some kind of e-commerce site that's all about affiliate sales, right? Everybody in e-commerce is trying to attract the same consumer. If you are a direct seller, you have more margin on which to spend to acquire that user. If you make your own stuff and then sell it, right? The DTC world. If you are selling other people's stuff, or you are an affiliate model, you have less of a margin to acquire that person. So you are going into a market trying to acquire customers with less money than the direct seller, right? That's just really, how are you going to compete at scale? It's incredibly difficult, right? Not to mention, you're just dealing with super thin margins all across the board anyway, right? So I think, like, there are a lot of times where, I can dismiss something out of hand to be like, you're not well positioned to acquire this customer, and, like, you just don't make enough money on each customer. Same thing with sort of enterprise sales, right? If it's a 6-month enterprise sales cycle, you got to make enough from that company to make it worth 6 months of the salesperson's time. Otherwise, that math just, like, doesn't really work out. And I think the last thing I would say is, does the skill set of the founder match the particular challenge of the whatever they're doing, right? So if you're about to launch some consumer social app, it's in your best interest, if you're a designer and you're a developer, right? If you can on the fly make tweaks and all of this sort of stuff, right? But if you are if this is something that's, like, heavily sales driven, you're at a disadvantage if you're a designer, right? And you've never done sales before. So I think it's helpful for those things to match.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Lucy, did you have anything else you wanted to get?
I mean, yeah, we still have a few questions here. I don't know which ones we want to answer.
So somebody asked about, I saw a question about plugging in to networks and the New York industry. I'll type it in the chat, although I have a feeling that a lot of people sort of came from it. I run a weekly newsletter at nycweeklynewsletter.com.
It's a great newsletter. You should subscribe.
Cool. Thank you. I need more subs. My wife just started a newsletter and she's got like over 1,000 already. So she's nipping at my tail there. So
Competition.
yeah. So I have always found that I build more of a network and a better network from two things. One, from being an organizer myself. So I would rather say that I would rather run a panel like this than attend somebody else's panel. Now, I'm sort of at this stage in my career where like, I don't really need to hear other VCs talk about stuff. Like I just, it's like two magicians pulling rabbits out of hats for each other, right? It's just a thing to me. But if I could be the interviewer, that's most interesting to me, right? So I got a chance to interview Jess from Sequoia 2 weeks ago, and it was great. And I think the other thing was like, it was a really interesting conversation. And it was actually easier to have that conversation because if I just asked her for a coffee or Zoom chat or whatever, like, what does she really get out of that, right? But if I say, hey, I'm putting you in front of an audience, now I'm sort of being her marketer in a sense, right? And so that's a helpful investment of time for her. We're still getting to have this sort of same conversation. She's getting a chance to understand my style and all that sort of stuff. And now I have a whole bunch of other people who are sort of following me as a thought leader or whatever because they attended the event. So I think like contributing to the community through events, especially ones that solve your own problem. I had a friend who was trying to figure out how to manage offshore developers. And so he started a panel of other people who had both successfully and unsuccessfully had offshore development and just pick their brains for like 60 minutes. It was awesome for him. Yeah. And it was great for everybody else too. And he put himself out there as like, oh yeah, Mike's a real, smart entrepreneur. He's, sort of tapped into the community. Much easier than trying to take coffee with 4 people individually and doing it kind of under the radar.
Yeah. Way more efficient and so many benefits that can come from it for a lot of people. It's such a different way of thinking. It's outside the traditional box.
And you know what? And again, like think about risk, right? Worst comes to worst, nobody shows, or 3 people show, or whatever. It's not a big deal, right? It's a little embarrassing if you don't get a big turnout, whatever. But like, it's fine. And if you do events, by the way, we accept submissions in the newsletter, so I'll do my best to try and get people to your event. I would say the other thing too is I personally like small groups. Mm-hmm. So for years and years, we've been doing these dinners where we go neighborhood by neighborhood. We split the cost of a chef. We have it in somebody's apartment. So we would do the Harlem dinner, the Greenpoint dinner, the West Village dinner, and we managed it in such a way where it took very little time to organize. That's why if you ever attend an event of mine and I ask you what neighborhood you live in, like I'm building a database of where everybody lives so I can invite you to a dinner in the future. We've even up until about mid-June, we were doing them during quarantine virtually. And I have to say, it was actually really nice that people lost interest in them post-June because they actually had other things to do. They could sort of go out and do outdoor dining and whatever. But during a period of time where we're all kind of shut in our houses, like it was a really great way to get to know more people. And the half-life of a meal is very long, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you share a meal with somebody, you can email them years later and just be like, hey, I don't know if you remember, but, we met up at the Park Slope dinner and that was a great conversation. I remember you saying, kind of X, Y, and Z. And I know people have collaborated from those things. I get, one of my best performing companies, a company called Arc Foods, came from one of those dinners, where it was just a recommendation from somebody else. And, I got to eat dinner with the person, and Noah seemed like a totally reasonable, smart, and interesting founder. And I got to meet 8 other people at that group too. So convening small groups, I think, is a very cool way to do stuff too.
Mm-hmm. Manageable and sort of more intimate.
Right. So maybe we'll do one last question before we let everybody else off the hook.
Okay. I don't know what you're saying, Abby, and as well, Charlie, but someone asked about a mentor. Thought that could be an interesting question to ask. How much value would you place on finding a mentor as a way to advance in the VC industry, and how should people who want to get into VC think about mentorship?
So I think it is incredibly useful to have people that you can talk things out with. And I think it's incredibly important for those people who to have your best interests in mind and to be really good at asking questions. So, I got to work for Josh Koppelman at First Round, and Fred Wilson from Union Square, 2 of the sort of top VCs out there. And Fred's very out there, right? So what he thinks about VC, you guys probably know as much as I do, right? Because he's constantly putting his thoughts out, like all of the time, right? And he's very much like me, very opinionated, and was a great person to watch early on in my career. My relationship with Josh was a little different, right? Josh is somebody who would ask me what I wanted in my career and would never suggest that I do things the way he wanted to, right? Josh is very team-oriented. Like First Round Capital is a very team-oriented shop. Josh has never, ever said to me to go get a partner, because he just knows that is just not my shtick, right? I mean, he, there were probably moments where I got super frustrated over the fact that I couldn't convince people on the team to sort of do a deal. And he was like, you should break out on your own. You should go do this and all of that sort of stuff. So I think the right mentor says, okay, what's your goal? And then let's talk about how you might get there. And that's why I'm a big believer in coaching. I was very lucky because when I first got to work at Union Square Ventures, Jerry Colonna from Reboot had an office in our office, because he's Fred Wilson's former partner from Flatiron Ventures, like back in the day. Mm-hmm. And so I got a chance to be coached by Jerry early on, and it was incredibly helpful to have somebody who had done my job, knew all of the players, and could ask me questions I wouldn't have asked myself. And finding so I would say I found the idea of mentor as like telling me what to do, I haven't found useful. Mm-hmm. Somebody asking me questions, that's so much more useful. And so I'm a big believer in coaching, and also just like surrounding yourself with people who are willing to ask you the hard questions, right? Like you have some friends that are probably really, really emotionally supportive, and they just like support everything you do. Get a couple of friends who call you out for your bullshit. I mean, who just, who tell you like, but wait, like you said you didn't want to do that. Why are you doing that? You said that you didn't want to take any clients who want you to do stuff that is below your skill level. Why you should drop that client. Like, whatever that kind of thing is, like incredibly useful.
Yeah, and it sounds like your mentor sort of happened organically and sort of built off personal or professional relationships and went from there. Because I guess a mentor, like you can't just go out and get one, and you need someone who truly knows you. So
yeah, but I wouldn't be afraid to make that ask either, right? Like I think it is totally fine. And you know what? Sometimes it's just, there's different levels. Sometimes it could just be an accountability buddy, right? To just basically go to somebody who you respect, who's maybe at the same level of you, and to say, hey, would you be willing to meet with me once every other month? We'll sit down for X period of time. We'll sit down for an hour and a half. We'll each get 45 minutes. We'll, we'll set out some goals. We'll put some specific plans together, and we'll hold each other accountable. That's super useful. And you know what? The other person would probably be thrilled that you asked. And I think that, it's a great way to keep honest about certain intentions.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I think it's really important to have people that you can bounce ideas off of, pitches, anything, just to make sure that you are basically on track and get different opinions.
For sure. Cool. So I hope this is helpful for folks.
Definitely was.
Yeah, this has been an amazing discussion. So thank you so much for your time, Charlie. And we all really appreciate, hearing from you and all these insights you provided. It's been amazing.
Cool. And I'll just remind everybody, if you're going down the entrepreneurial path and you're in the New York City area and you're looking for that first check, that lead investor, it's Charlie at brooklynbridge.vc. I also have this little calendar widget on my site. You can apply to get some time. I can't promise a meeting, but I'll always try and get back to people with feedback on early stuff. So, or sometimes I'll rope you into being on a panel.
Which we love doing.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Thank
All right.
you, Charlie.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.